Thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation to be here tonight. Being at this place in the position in the batting order reminds me of a letter that Winston Churchill got from George Bernard Shaw. It said, "Dear Winnie, I have a new play opening next Tuesday night and I'd be delighted if you could come. And bring a friend if you have one." Churchill wrote back and said, "Well, I won't be able to come on opening night, but I'll come the second night if there is one." Some of you may remember the name Liz Carpenter. Some of you may have read her obituary a couple of months ago. She worked with the Johnson administration. After the White House years, she wrote a book called Ruffles and Flourishes. She was on a book tour promoting it, and one night in a hotel lobby in Atlanta, Georgia, by chance, she ran into her former White House colleague, Arthur Schlesinger. Arthur said, "Gee, Liz, that was a great book of yours. I really enjoyed it. Who wrote it for you?" She said, "Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, Arthur. Who read it to you?" I've been allotted 20 minutes to talk, and I'll try to stay within that, and then a few minutes for questions. When we go back and look at early civilizations that have declined and collapsed, the one whose archaeological sites we now study, more often than not, it was a shortage of food that brought down these early civilizations. The Sumerians, the Mayans, you can go down the list. Until recently, I had rejected the idea that food could be the weak link in our modern civilization. I now not only think it could be a weak link, but that it probably is the weak link. And I'd like to sort of look at the global environmental issues through a food lens. If we look at the environmental trends that are undermining our future, almost all of them affect the food prospect. Deforestation, soil erosion, falling water tables, deteriorating grasslands, expanding deserts, collapsing fisheries, rising temperatures, melting ice sheet and rising sea level, melting mountain glaciers that is disrupting river flows, disappearing species. Go down the list. Almost all of them affect the food prospect. I'd like to talk about three briefly: falling water tables, melting ice sheets, and melting mountain glaciers. Water tables are now falling in countries that contain half the world's people, including the big three grain producers: China, India, and the United States. Water tables are falling because of overpumping, mostly for irrigation. 70% of all the water we use in the world is for irrigation. Industry uses about 20%. We have 10% for residential uses. What in effect we're doing is we're inflating food production in the short run by overpumping aquifers. But once the aquifers are depleted, then pumping is necessarily reduced to the rate of recharge. So in effect, we're creating food bubbles in at least 15, maybe 20 countries in the world, including the two big ones, China and India. A World Bank study indicates that 175 million people in India are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. In China, we estimate that 130 million Chinese are being fed with grain produced by overpumping. This is a way of sort of measuring the size of the food bubble. There are a number of other countries where the food bubble is either bursting or about to burst. One is Saudi Arabia, which has been pumping from a fossil aquifer and has been self-sufficient in wheat production for 20 years. That aquifer is now largely depleted. Fossil aquifers do not recharge. This aquifer is largely depleted. Saudi Arabia's wheat production has dropped 70% in the last 3 years and will probably be to zero by the year after next. And Saudi Arabia will be importing all of its grain. So we have these food bubbles that are starting to burst. Saudi Arabia is the first where we've actually seen the bubble burst and production begin to decline. Yemen is not far behind. The second threat to food security, environmental threat to food security, is melting ice sheets. If the Greenland ice sheet were to melt entirely, and that would not happen overnight, it would raise sea level some 23 feet. That's Greenland. The West Antarctic ice sheet, which has started to break up, if it breaks up entirely, will raise sea level another 15 feet. The latest projections are for a 6-foot rise up to 6 feet during this century. But even a 3-foot rise in sea level would inundate many of the rice-growing river deltas in Asia. A 3-foot rise in sea level would put half the rice land in Bangladesh underwater. A 3-foot rise would cover much of the Mekong Delta, which produces half of the rice in Vietnam, which is the world's #2 rice exporter. And there are another 19 rice-growing river deltas in Asia that would be affected in varying degrees by just a 1-meter rise in sea level. It's an indication of the complexity of our modern world when ice melting on a large island in the far North Atlantic can shrink the rice harvest in Asia, where half the world's people live. This is one of many complex linkages that I could talk about, but the third one is melting mountain glaciers. Someone was saying here earlier that members of their church didn't believe in global warming, or if they did, it wasn't our responsibility, it wasn't our fault. I would suggest they look at what's happening to mountain glaciers. They wouldn't have to go further than Glacier National Park, which when it was established a century or so ago had 150 glaciers. At the end of last year, there were 27 left. In April, the Park Service announced that 2 more have gone. There are now 25 left. And they expect them all to be gone before the end of this decade. But the real threat to food security comes with the melting glaciers in the Himalayas and on the Tibetan Plateau. It is the ice melt from those glaciers that sustains the major rivers of Asia during the dry season: the Indus, the Ganges, the Mekong, the Yangtze, the Yellow, and many smaller rivers. This ice melt not only sustains the flow of those rivers, but it sustains the irrigation systems dependent on those rivers. So what happens to those mountain glaciers in Asia is going to affect food prices for everyone in the world. Again, the idea that glaciers melting on the Tibetan Plateau could affect food prices at US supermarkets as China comes into the world market for massive quantities of grain is not something that's intuitively obvious unless you think a bit about it. But we're living in a very complex world now, and the interaction between the environmental system, the economic system, and the political system. Let me just talk for a minute about what's happening, about 3 trends on the demand side of the food equation. One, we're all familiar with: population growth, 80 million more people a year. That means that tonight, there were 216,000 people at the dinner table who were not there last night. And it means that tomorrow night there'll be an additional 216,000 people at the dinner table. If that keeps going long enough, it eventually puts pressure on the Earth's land and water resources. And that's what we're now beginning to see. Population growth is not new, but moving up the food chain is a relatively recent development in human history and evolution. It's only since World War II that grain-fed livestock products, beef and milk and eggs and pork and poultry, have begun to be produced largely with grain. So moving up the food chain takes more grain. The third factor increasing demand for food is the capacity we now have to convert grain into oil, i.e. ethanol. Last year, we harvested 415 million tons of grain in this country. 106 million tons of that harvest went to ethanol distilleries. What this means is that the world price of grain is now tied to the price of oil, because if the fuel value of the grain exceeds the food value, the market will move the grain into the energy economy. This is new, and I don't think most economists have yet quite realized that if oil goes from $80 to 100, 120, 150, even 200, the price of grain will follow it up in the absence of government intervention. If we leave it to the market, that's where things go.